Welcome to The Choice. This is Kurt Doolittle. Episode 10, Unmasking Nasim Taleb. Sometime last year, Taleb started his attack on the importance of intelligence. Taleb is one more in a long line of pseudoscientists trying to drag advanced Western civilization into primitive sensibilities. But let's get into a little depth and explain why by putting Taleb in context with his peers. Now listen to this long line of almost exclusively Semitic underminers of every single aspect of Western civilization. Cantor and Bohr's replatonization of mathematics after Descartes' rescue of it. Freud, Bose, Gould, Pinker, and now Harari's feminist revisionist history of man. Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky's Marxism, communism, and Bolshevism to revolt against Darwin's explanation of Western civilization's success. Gramsci, Adorno, Marcuse, Fromm, Herkomer, Baudrillard, Lyotard's neo-Marxist attack on Western civilization, its values and culture. Lucas, Derrida, Foucault's and the postmodern revolt against Western civilization's discovery of truth by correspondence with physical, natural, and evolutionary laws. Rand and Rothbard's libertarianism as a revolt against rule of law and demand for production of commons. Strauss, Pearl, Kristol's neoconservatism as a revolt against secular academic left's pacifism, as if it wasn't enough already. Sam Harris and less so Jordan Peterson's selective sophistry, Moldbug Brett and Eric Weinstein's popularity by critique, never once proposing a solution, just gossiping and whining, and Schmachtenberger, who I do respect a bit, his search for third-wave socialism by extending false hope to the hopeless task of defeating those physical, natural, and evolutionary laws. And until now, we haven't really been able to prevent these attacks because, honestly, we hadn't codified Western group strategy such that our defenders could argue it. Why? Because our ethos is military and militial, and it's been handed down generation by generation as the military tradition, the European traditional egalitarian law of warriors we call the peerage, and the law of tort, against which the envious middle-class philosophers and lower-class theologians wrote nothing but complaint, begging for crumbs of change without grasping that it was martial epistemology and martial reciprocal commitment to self-determination, sovereignty under rule of law to preserve it, military reporting as testimony before the jury of peers that made those competing arguments possible. Or that the failure of every other civilization to discover, adapt to, and apply the physical, natural, and evolutionary laws, failure to preserve self-determination, failure to produce sovereignty, reciprocity, evidentiary testimony, argument before a jury of peers, failure to create markets in all aspects of life as a result, failure to recognize the preservation of the law of war, law of court, and laws of faith, and the equivalent priesthoods of each that made their debates possible, like all other civilizations that sought monopoly instead of a market competition between priesthoods. Because the Semitic people can't produce commons. They're tribal people permanently seeking a despot to produce commons so that they can focus on self, family, and tribe, and the illusions that preserve the self-image of self, family, and tribe, despite their inability to produce commons, states, complex organizations, and complex societies. They have never had and never developed the trust necessary to produce a commons, to produce a defense, to maintain a state, and produce a middle class. The entire history of the Middle East is parasitism upon lowly peasant farmers and parasitism upon the trade routes that passed through the Middle East as a nexus of the four continents. And the one people, to unite them, did so in the worst way possible. Supernatural religion that mandated conquest, consumption of everything they conquered, institutionalized ignorance, stagnation, dysgenia, and eventual collapse. So when Jews couldn't hold their home, they found new hosts to ride on. When the Arabs ran out of capital to consume, they were conquered by the Turks. When the Turks conquered the toll bridge to Europe we call Byzantium, the Europeans were forced to develop the Age of Sail, united the entire world in trade, and the Middle East was deprived of its long-standing asset and reason for any prosperity, the shopping mall of the continents. And its weakness as a low-trust, primitive, dysgenic society, or collection of societies, was exposed. And if not for oil, the Middle East would be on par with sub-Saharan Africa or southern India, and for what it's worth, where South America is heading right now in the same direction. Sometime last fall, Claire Lehman at Quillette stated, Taleb, like Gould, is trying to demonize mainstream psychology, but he's only successful in creating a folk demon for the lay public. He knows that anyone with any technical expertise thinks he's a bit of a clown, but he doesn't care because accuracy is less important to him than fame. Now, given that Nasim and I share similarly unpleasant temperaments and objectives, I don't really want to be the front man of the subject because, of course, I'm equally assailable for my temperament. But I do need to put a stake in the heart of this deception, and I think Stefan Molyneux's done a good job. He didn't take it all the way. Taleb is not trying to take down psychology. He's trying to justify Arab immigration to the West and satisfy the chip on his shoulder as a Christian Arab. He permanently feels inferior, and this is why he works so hard to try to demonstrate otherwise. And he's trying to claim intelligence as a limited benefit to individual income. But he's not showing how intelligence is an unlimited benefit to everyone's income. And he's not separating conscientiousness and intelligence as the two factors that produce the difference between income and wealth. Ashkenazi civilization selected for cognitively female verbal ability, and Europeans put them through multiple survival bottlenecks, preserving their best, and the Ashkenazi got what they'd bred for, the ability to carry female task workloads, which are higher, female ability to read people, which is exceptional, female verbal ability, which is, of course, higher than male, without realizing the cost of those gains, and that was female intuition. And that living off the commons of host people reinforced that intuition. And that as a consequence, they developed and institutionalized the female means of conflict, gossiping, rallying, shaming, strawmanning, and undermining host peoples, what we men in the men's movement called the shit test in the vernacular. And they enjoy it as much as they enjoy cheating and shopping. But they're just as unaware of what they're doing as are women unaware that they're doing it. So the frequent observation that all Jews are female is fundamentally true. Unfortunately, we've only recently both let Jews and females into society, politics, institutions, and the academy, and together, without realizing they had the same intuitions, we didn't increase our norms, traditions, and most importantly, laws and politics to prevent female superpredation that undermines dominant males and their group strategies. So we have high constraints on male superpredator violence and force, but no constraints on female superpredatory undermining. Hence the destruction of our civilization from within as the Jewish Christians destroyed Rome from inside and out, and our immigrants can't immigrate just as Roman slaves in third worlds couldn't immigrate into a Roman aristocratic civilization. So let's explore Taleb's criticism of what he calls the educated but intelligent and expose that they're educated, intelligent, and moral, and he and his people are not, and they can't even conceive of it. Western and Eastern civilizations, meaning the Far East, China, used testing to successfully filter out corruption for positions in government. We used the same for military and then the academy. The Chinese put more emphasis on bureaucracy, testing, and family, and the West on family equality, military participation as insurance against corruption. In other words, we we emphasized military bureaucracy, and the Chinese did civil bureaucracy, but in essence, we did the same character test in both ends. In truth, this is one of the reasons the West kept accelerating while China stagnated. It is possible to fail, and it is possible for any system of organized testing to eventually devolve into nonsense. It's very difficult to survive if your martial epistemology devolves into nonsense. The more thoroughly a civilization produces rule of law, the more reliable the jury, the more truthful the speech, and the more the wealth is available across the bell curve, with complexity, or what we call IQ, determining your market segment, and conscientiousness determining your ability to accumulate wealth within it. Unfortunately, we don't measure conscientiousness and IQ in education with equal weight, and we fail to train mindfulness to imitate conscientiousness and train calculation through excessive repetition in the Asian method to create the discipline of error detection, or train each other in ethics, law, economics, and politics and general knowledge to compensate for IQ. The only substitute for intelligence is repetition at the bottom and general knowledge in the middle. We can actually compensate for these things somewhat. You cannot compensate for the rate of which you learn with IQ, however. What Taleb is attempting to obscure is the West can create large, complex organizations because of our trust, our rule of law, and by our filtering out of corruption. By granting privilege to IQ, where IQ seeks to prevent crimes, not exploit weaknesses in norms, traditions, and institutions. This is the key. What Taleb is trying to obscure is the West can create large, complex organizations because of trust and rule of law that filters out corruption by granting privilege to IQ, where IQ seeks to prevent exploitations, not make them. What he's actually saying is the opposite. He can't face that fact because Levantines cannot create trust, rule of law, or large complex organizations because they think lying is a tool, cunning is of merit, outwitting by cunning is superior than outwitting by increases in productivity, quality, or innovation. And that the commons are to be pilfered rather than invested in at every opportunity. So Taleb is missing the whole point. The commons are to be defended against people who would be cunning rather than exploited by those who are cunning. That he's only able to use his techniques of via negativa risk investment at scale because he's the only high-trust polity on earth that hasn't yet outlawed the immoral means of gain in the politics, academy, and media and financial sectors. Or that it's only possible to develop these kind of complex bets within a high-trust society in the first place. So he is, like his alter ego Fat Tony or their champion George Soros, they're by Western ethics and morality simply scammers that we haven't increased our law to prevent. So the West at present and the East in the past are filtering for responsibility in detecting theft, fraud, schemes, and abuses. We use our best via negativa to suppress the crimes of the many. The West hasn't expanded its law against gains from unproductive, fraudulent, or false works, whether in finance, media, academy, or politics. And the 20th century was the second age of great scams, from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in the ancient world with their false promise of heaven after death if they helped undermine truth, reason, reciprocity, markets, and science in the living world, to Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, and human difference denial in the modern world to undermine truth, reason, reciprocity, markets, and science, and most likely to undermine the natural consequence of Western civilization and Eastern civilization, which is incremental market eugenics, suppressing reproduction at the bottom. Yet Taleb's entire literature is devoted to lionizing scamming while ridiculing those who hold positions of privilege, meaning influence, precisely because they are not in the scamming business, and Westerners don't even intuit the possibility of scamming like Semitic peoples do. European sense-making is just the mirror opposite. Now, this analysis will expose the primary difference between Middle Eastern and Western people, and it will explain why certain groups profit from certain industries, if you catch my meaning, because they are naturally immoral and Westerners are not. And because it's new to us, Westerners haven't simply outlawed yet those means of immorality. Morality requires reciprocity. Reciprocity, which I'll repeat again, requires productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer, free of imposition of cost by externality against the demonstrated interests of others, whether private or common. This means that scamming is prohibited in Western civilization, and it's one of the reasons we drive people into the highly productive work because they're disincentivized from participating in unproductive work. It's quite profitable to engage in immorality among permissive, high-trust moral people, just as it's less profitable to do so among low-trust, low-complexity, immoral people. And the financial business is, by and large, unproductive, at least at microscale. In other words, the Westerner would never engage in the tactics used by George Soros, which was extractive. He did. It's not natural for Westerners to engage in what Fat Tony and Nasim Taleb find, or George Soros find witty and cunning, because we find it correctly immoral, unethical, unearned gains, which it is. So whether you cast these people as amoral, in other words, not knowing what they're doing, or immoral, and whether you can cast them as intentional or unintentionally immoral, or whether you say it's genetic or cultural differences, the reality is that only Westerners practice material reciprocity, and that verbal reciprocity we call truth, and because we do, we produce high-trust, large, complex, disproportionately productive organizations, from the family to the business to the enterprise to the industry to the state. And lower trust people that do not sort for trust and grant privilege to people who have ability to preserve that trust fail. And this is what the Chinese and the West did. We specialized in creating suppression of crime. What institutions did the Middle East foster instead? Familism, tribalism, cunning, the ethics of the bazaar instead of the market, cheating, lying, rent-seeking, taxing trade routes rather than producing. They lauded inbreeding, familism, tribalism. And not trust and productivity, they reward dogmatists and cheaters as heroic. As such, they couldn't produce a middle class majority population, middle class majority ethics. And as such, they couldn't develop trust at the top and push trustworthiness down into the lower middle, working, and lower classes. And because of their emphasis on happiness of the underclasses, in other words, non-adaptivity, they emphasized non-learning and non-adaptivity, they produced dysgenia and a population so costly to educate and so religiously ignorant that they can't form a complex production hierarchy. This is why they remained poor despite taxing world trade and consuming the genetic, cultural, institution, knowledge, and aesthetic capital of the 5 great civilizations of the ancient world and reducing it to their standard of ignorance, poverty, and dysgenia. So yes, you can make money from your conscientiousness at every point in the IQ curve, but you can't push trust, reciprocity, truth, duty, jury, contract, and rule of law down to a population and produce the multiples of scale unless you filter upward for intelligence and conscientiousness, and you reward that combination with status and income in the elimination of those who would engage in unproductive profits. This forces a status hierarchy that must be imitated in order to gain advantage and creates the wonder that's Western civilization and the organization that's Eastern civilization and why all other civilizations fell so dramatically behind it by consequence. And that's even before we get into the fact that smarter people are better at suppressing error, which strangely Taleb, as another proponent of the via negativa, seems to overlook, and that as we scale, opportunities are not scarcer but more plentiful. So are the increasing opportunities for error. So, in the most reductive of examples, Taleb has been trying to teach the West how to devolve into a low-trust, multicultural, multifamilial, tribal gaggle of Middle Eastern scam artists practicing the ethics of the bazaar and calling it, amazingly, smart. Meanwhile, he fails to grasp that those educated but unintelligent people are in their positions to eliminate error and prevent low trust and allow us to increase productivity and scale and to profit from that exercise, not to maximize personal profit without producing those commons as a result. So our society is organized to maximize profit in the commons, which, if you have been following all along, this argument I'm making means that not maximizing personal profit maximizes everyone's gains. And that we simply haven't regulated the financial industry out of violating Western law of reciprocity and productivity by a 100% tax on gains that didn't result in increases in productivity. And we haven't nationalized consumer credit so that consumers don't pay interest on consumption, and investors, instead of rent-seeking on consumers, have to seek out increasingly long-term high-capital investment gains that are productive rather than just, again, rent-seeking upon consumers whose government has failed to provide them with adequate consumer protection against financial predation. I mean, as far as I know, over $1 trillion is extracted from the people every year that should be in federal coffers. Given that our entire budget is $4 trillion, that we only produce $3 trillion and change, and then some, and that would mean closer to a balanced budget in exchange for consumers having zero interest rates and owning their home in 12 instead of 30 years and being able to save then for retirement. So let me reduce Taleb's life work as an essayist and ridicule of Western civilization to its foundations. A. Mandelbrot was right that the stock market is just noise as the federal funds rate moves through the galaxy of the economy, and that without inside information or manipulation, it's really a scam for all but major fund investors who are able to manipulate the market. And here comes the big one. Rule of law and involuntary warranty must be extended by our people from commercial goods and services to all information in the marketplace. That's right. We gave license to people to not warranty their words the 20th, and that's the reason we're here today. All that big list of names at the top, those are people who could sell lies. Incredibly interesting, incredibly desirous political, social, and informational lies. They're not warrantable, and they violate physical, natural, and evolutionary law. So we have to extend our laws to protect people against these means of deceit. So if you made that leap with me, then let's follow me with 5 further points on Taleb. 1, he popularized Mandelbrot's insight that unforeseen outliers are more influential than all the cumulative predictable events. Most writers that reach readers are in the IQ 130 range and popularize other people's ideas. They rarely invent their own, but this was a service he did for our generation and perhaps all generations to come if, and only if, we can convert that understanding of fragility into policy. And of course, we have done this in the constitutional amendments we've recommended. Point 2, Taleb put into words what conservatives intuit, that our natural instincts for continuous improvement and efficiency create fragility, and that we should instead subject everything we do to stresses. This is more obvious in the failure of our medical community to practice war games like the military does and led to our current healthcare crisis. I don't know when this will be out, and I don't know how long it will last, but we're in the middle of this COVID fiasco. What's more obvious is that Treasury doesn't play war games either, because they have not converted the financial transaction system to strategic infrastructure despite the crash of 2008 and the demonstration that the business cycle theory was inescapable. So there's a failure of our institutions and our government once again to reduce fragility. Point 3, Taleb isn't a scientist, he's an essayist and a philosophical Platonist in the continental tradition. You don't know what that means. There's a sort of romantic philosophy, a literary philosophy in Plato's tradition, and what we call science and law in the Anglo and Aristotelian tradition. And most of us use the term continental and those people as it's an insult. Unfortunately, he also bears the burden of biases from the worst of the Semitic traditions. So at first glance, he popularized Mandelbrot's insights through humorous, ego-inspiring essays, making us feel smart like it made him feel smart. But the reality is we've been smart for 5,000 years. We've demanded warranty of one's words, martial testimony, reporting in all walks of life. These costs let us construct commons, and the returns on commons make our disproportionate private returns possible. Because commons require high trust, a demand for productivity to profit, and warranty of truthfulness, and that's why Europeans are the only people on earth to have produced those commons that we call the civil society. Point 4, Taleb studies literature. He reads a lot of it, but less so cognitive science, economics, and law. So for some reason, he doesn't seem to grasp that the West solved skin in the game through warranty enforced by rule of law, and that Semitic people can't practice warranty because they can't practice truth, they can't practice truth before face, and they can't produce rule of law because of it. Point 5, Taleb certainly doesn't grasp the foundations of mathematics, and he's a victim of the Semitic remystification of mathematics in the 19th and early 20th century as a set theory of language or Platonic idealism, rather than the traditional European system of measurement with geometry, engineering, and operationalism in the Aristotelian realist tradition, meaning that it's not possible to determine the information necessary to change state without first developing general artificial intelligence and in turn a unit of measure for it, which is any student of the history of the development of the various means of commensurability should have grasped immediately. All philosophers produce a few insights. He's produced his, but as usual, the substantive insights aren't his. Like many non-European users of European tools, his empirical and philosophical efforts hit a predictable dead end because he didn't understand the European sense-making those tools were constructed upon. His remaining ideas make for good wisdom on life, and they really do. He's extremely well-read, and we don't want to dismiss that. But compared to the arguments he's making, they're relatively petty. Those he is most proud of are simply examples of why Semitic as well as other less developed people cannot be integrated into Western civilization because whether IQ or some other genetic disposition is the case, they're fundamentally unable to adapt to the counterintuitive depth of European sense-making, the quest for that which is true and decidable by physical, natural, and evolutionary laws, regardless of whether it's preferable. We're taught to be warriors and judges that happen to manage business in the off-season. They're taught to be bargainers and bazaar merchants without exposure to judicial or martial ethics. And that is our difference. Because what we do as Europeans is expensive. We make commons. The European equivalent of communism is in capitalizing commons, not in consumption. And capitalizing commons, which is the purpose of my work, is absent from our, quote, individualist philosophy. Europeans make it so you need a little house, a good food, and because courts, churches, businesses, streets, parks, and cemeteries are equally sacred grounds under which you must suppress your behavior for the good of the commons, and they should be as safe as your kitchen. And our truth and reciprocity in our law as sacred as our faith. And no other people can do it, which is why our immigrant cities are dying one at a time and why the only government and financial sector parasites are benefiting from it. This is Kurt Doolittle. Thank you for listening to The Choice.